markets and how buildings can begin to respond in an automatic manner, right? So the trees that I'm going to talk about here are regression trees, and we'll see how they come into play. But first, let's look at what this volatility problem looks like, right? So this is January of this year, and you can see the volatility in the market going from an average price of about $25 per megawatt hour in the East Coast to more than $800 within 15 minutes from the average. And if you look at 2015, this has been by far the hottest year, and that's the first record since temperatures have been recorded since 1880. The second record has been the hottest year by the largest margin from the previous hottest years. So this volatility is only going to increase, and so if you look at it in the summer months, there is a 32x increase in the price within 15 minutes from the average price, and this is from just this July. And it doesn't stop just in the summers. In the winters, this is the polar vortex, where we have an average price of about $31, and it spikes to about $2,680, all within the course of a few minutes, right? So, and this is so you can see the peaks are really starting to affect us, more broadly and across seasons. And these basically trigger peaker plants, which are more expensive, more polluting plants that cause the price of the generation to rise. So then comes in demand response. It's really a virtual source, virtual generator. And in the US, the demand response has, in the past year, a capacity of over 70 gigawatts, or representing about 11% of the capacity of the market, by far much larger than renewables. And so what happens when a demand response event is that as the price is going to go high and we start to predict that there's going to be a peak price later in the day or in the next day, then the grid operators and the curtailment service providers issue bids, so essentially for curtailment from commercial, industrial, and institutional customers. And to do curtailment through the demand response sustainable period, and in response to that, they basically provide incentives. So for example, our Penn campus, if we reduced 1.8 megawatts on that July day, we got $440,000. If we violated that, we would get about a $720,000 penalty for 35 minutes of curtailment. So that's more than $20,000 per minute. So you can see this is big money. So you can see if you compare it to making systems more efficient versus systems more responsive to volatility, efficiency is very low margin. This is extremely high frequency and high margin businesses. So the question really is that if this is your predicted trajectory of your baseline, how low can you go while maintaining custom conditions within the environment, right? So you can obviously try to manipulate each of these variables over here. But there are three kind of sub-problems over here, right? So the first problem is, how do you predict what the building's power consumption is going to be when there is no demand response? So that's the baselining problem. And the second problem is, well, if you were to do, say, a certain curtailment strategy, how do you predict what is the response profile of your building or of your set of buildings during that demand response action? You could have many different types of demand response actions. And so usually buildings have fixed strategies that are designed a few years ago. And they would say you can pick between these strategies. And so the question is, can you actually play it out and see how that's going to happen for the next few hours and actually look at what the response of the building is? The most interesting question then is, how can we do this automatically? How can we use the data of the building to synthesize control for the hundreds of thousands of variables that we have, say, across a large campus? Like the Penn campus has about 130 buildings, over 300,000 control variables. How can we figure out for these different parameters how to actually tweak and set the set points automatically? So synthesize control. So demand response has traditionally been very manual, very much a rule-based, based on best practices, where you design a strategy, and whether that strategy is going to actually do as much curtailment or affect your custom conditions for that day is always a question, because there is no, these are static rules of thumb. There are no feedback or state information of the building that's being used in these strategies. And there's no predictive capability whether you will achieve the curtailment or not. And these are kind of strategies, by Siemens, which is a pretty common sort of way in which demand response is done. So these are rule-based strategies. So say, for example, if you're going to say turn on your chiller, it took, on the 21st of this month, it took 23 minutes. But for higher humidity, it's taking 42 minutes, but the price increased. And ideally, you want to use some sort of model-based control that has predictable capabilities and can actually be used for control. But these require models to control all these different variables. So there are different ways to model a building. I'll go through them very quickly. So there's a white box model, essentially, that's saying take your building plan, HVAC plans, go floor by floor, and then basically hire a building modeling expert to then model this within Transys or Energy Plus or a different sort of building simulation tools. And then you got to sort of do the tuning. And these are extremely costly, and they would take more than 7 to 9 months to do this for a large building, and then to tune it, and you require, there's a lot of expense. And then you got to repeat that for the next building, because the next building is quite unique compared to this one. And these are not suitable for controls, very large number of parameters. Then you could choose, well, let's say we can simplify the problem and use gray box models or reduced order models, where we eliminate some of the details or lump them together. But it's the same sort of issue. So this was done, for example, in the DOE project we worked with for this building to build a Transys model. It took over 6 months just to make the model and to do all the mapping and then to tune this building. And so again, over here, it is promising, but it's not suitable for model-based control, just way too many parameters. Buildings are very unique. They're not just like under the Toyota Camry car. It's supposed to be very similar. They must be modeled very long time spans for the lifetime of a building. And a lot of non-linear interactions, complex interactions that we need to capture in these models. So that comes to black box models, right? So these are data-driven models, which are great for prediction and can provide coarse-grained prediction, but they are not based on the physics, and hence you cannot use them for control directly. So in the past, our work sort of looked at how to take gray box models and to actually simplify them so that we can use them for control but make them lower cost. We automated the process of building gray box models. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how we can take black box models but make them suitable for control. So use data-driven or machine learning models to synthesize control strategies. And that gives us the best of both worlds, right? So how can we use the simplicity of rule-based DR and use the predictive capability of this model-based control approaches? So that brings us to Demand Response Advisor, which uses regression trees to build demand response recommendations. So we actually recommend to building facilities what to do. So a regression tree is essentially like a tree, but flipped, and where you have different node conditions for classifying what you're really observing till you come to possible outcomes. So we are basically classifying how this building is behaving based on historic behavior. And at the leaves, what we're going to do is something very interesting. So we start with a lot of this data of weather, schedule, and the building operations. And essentially what we have is our response variable, which is a power consumption. That is a function of all these predictor variables over here. And we're doing this sort of recursive binary partition because you do not want to use a single linear regression model as the building has a lot of complexities, interactions, non-linearities. And essentially, this allows us to figure out what are the response variables for the different conditions that the building has been through over the historic training period. And so this is the problem with just using linear regression for, or even polynomial regression for these sort of very complex and nonlinear systems. And so where we use regression trees is a very efficient way to partition this. So this is obviously it's known stuff, and then we can map this to a tree-based formula where we see that where we have these if this then that sort of conditions. And so essentially what we are doing now is feeding all this data into a family of different regression trees for different uses, right? So for baselining, for demand response policy evaluation, for prediction, for synthesis, and applying them for baselining, demand response evaluation, and for synthesis. And I'll walk through each of these. But first, the main reason to choose this kind of approach is that we need to make sure it's very interpretable for the facilities managers. They don't want to use an artificial neural networks approach where they don't know what the black box is really doing and why is it doing so shutting off a certain chiller for a certain duration. With regression trees like this is trained on over 3.5 million data points over the past year. you can see that they are very interpretable, and we can even bring a better visualization to this, where we see if this, then that, and we can sort of look at the provenance of why certain responses are done. So for baseline prediction, we are within 3% of the actual actual baseline for the buildings, and we've done this for a variety of buildings over here. So where we have the ground truth is in black, and for different sort of single trees, cross-validated trees, boosted trees, random forests, we can sort of compare the different approaches, but we are all within 3% of the baseline. So we did this baselining for the building 101, which is part of the DOE's test facility in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. But when we did this for many, many different buildings and different types of buildings, this is a Wharton Business School, this is a laboratory building, this is a clinical research building, and get more than like 92 to 95% prediction accuracy in under half an hour for each of these buildings as we churn through them. So fine, you can do prediction, but how good is the prediction, according to, say, a litmus test? So ASHRAE had this competition where over 150 teams competed, where they gave 4 months of data, and we were supposed to then predict for the next 2 months what are the operational sort of response for the system in January and February. And so this was an open competition with more than 100 participants, and we ranked number 2 in that, and which is a good validation that our approach is good with prediction. The number 1 used artificial neural networks, which is approach that is not so interpretable as regression trees provides. So then we come to strategy evaluation. If you have fixed strategies like buildings do in terms of a demand response, so to change the set point, say, of the chiller and change the set point for chilled water and change set point of zone temperature, then we can actually predict what the response of the building will be for different strategies and be able to look at how these will actually roll out. And we are within about 6% of the ground truth for prediction of different strategies with each of these different approaches. So the way the regression trees work is that you're starting from the root, and then you're basically filtering through with different controllable and non-controllable variables to come to a leaf, which basically says that this is the linear model of the building. But so taking each of these variables, we want to really be able to predict what is the power consumption. So but we can't run control on a standard regression tree because we are mixing we can't sort of specify the order, the appearance of controllable and non-controllable variables. So there's no forecast for manipulatable variables like the different knobs that we have in a building. So what we do then is a simple trick where we actually separate the variables, where we actually train the tree on the trees learned on the non-manipulatable variables, the weather, the disturbances. And then that brings us to a linearized model that we have of the building for that environment condition, say for that day, for that humidity, et cetera. And then where we have the manipulatable variables as with coefficients from the tree. So that gives us a linear model of that building. And then we can actually now, say, run our optimization to minimize the power of that. And then we can execute now the different strategies that we would have for the different variables for chilled water, for the airflow, for lighting, et cetera, and actually do a synthesized curtailments that are able to achieve a certain required power level of curtailment. And this is actually the strategy for different lighting, for chilled water, and for the zone temperature that we actually synthesized through that duration. And so this is all done automatically. This is all done online in real time, right? Just 5 minutes in advance notification, and we can synthesize this. And so we see that with this sort of approach for a DOE reference building that is 12 stories and has 20 different zones, this allows us to achieve a savings of $45,000, and that's about a 37.8% reduction in the summer bill of that building. So this has been developed into a tool that can automatically churn through all the building data. We have applied it to more than several dozens of buildings, and that takes us through the steps of prediction, and we can work with messy data, a lot of outliers, and then we can go from prediction of baseline to evaluation to synthesis and generate reports in that sense. So then after this paper was submitted, we came up with an improvement where we can actually take into account the custom conditions we want of the building as a constraint. So here we actually train building trees on the power forecast, but then for each of the different zones, so in our case we had 19 zones for our test building, we trained different zone temperature trees for that. So that is actually the response in terms of the thermal comfort levels. And so therefore we can actually build an optimization over here where we are minimizing the power but subject to the thermal constraints. And so this actually gives us more aggressive curtailment because we know the thermal constraints we got to maintain now. And so compared to a rule of thumb approach, we are 17% more aggressive in terms of a curtailment. So that's more benefit at an extremely high energy cost. And here you can see this. I'm going to zoom into this period over here during the curtailment period. You can see what's happening here is that these are the different leaves, the different models of the building that we are switching through every 5 minutes and making sure that the transitions are still smoothened out so we're not having any jerk behavior in the building. And so you can see the curtailment is maintained even though the conditions of the building are changing every 5 to 15 minutes. So these are 5-minute intervals based on the 5-minute data that we get. And so you can see that the adaptation is very much online, and it is an adaptive control system that's running here. And then here you can see that this is a strategy synthesis with thermal and comfort constraints. Right? So for each of the different 19 zones, we are maintaining the temperature within the dead band while doing the curtailment. So this is a very interesting improvement over the initial DR advisor approach. Because now we can specify a variety of thermal constraints or even lighting or any comfort constraints in that. So with demand response advisor, we are basically sucking all the data of the building, historic and real-time data, and we provide basically better visibility, more transparency for better dispatch from curtailment service providers, so they don't have to just pick up the phone like they do to a large extent and say, can you curtail 1.8 megawatts? Our campus responds and says, oh, well, let me call you back in 5 minutes. I think we can curtail 1.2 megawatts. But they don't know exactly how to do that curtailment or whether they will achieve it with a certain policy. So then we get much better response on the demand side because we actually can synthesize recommendations for how you would actually do a curtailment and actually show them this is a trajectory that you're going to follow through with the curtailment. And so just to summarize, this is an approach that we have with many different partners from EPRI, Alstom, and the School of Architecture to provide this. And so actually we want to show that money does grow on regression trees. I'll stop there.